the economic freedom fighters. They're not as radical as many people think they are. They believe, which is an old African nationalist belief, that the state must play a prominent role in the economy. But when it actually comes to practice, as I have pointed out, the state has been an obstacle. State-owned industries have been an obstacle to the performance of the South African economy. Economic freedom fighters know that as well as I do. So they understand that there has to be a private sector participation in the key logistics and power generation industry.
So in this really interesting interview on Bloomberg, featuring political analyst Moeletsi Mbeki, who is actually a South African political analyst, he's actually arguing that the EFF is not as radical as it really sells itself to be. We know that the EFF has actually, communicated its vision as a radical Fanonian leftist socialist party in that regard that wants to expropriate land in South Africa. But anyway, Moeletsi Mbeki here argues that the EFF is not as radical as it claims. Let's listen to what he means by this, and I'll be back for some really interesting analysis on, an article I found on the internet here, the really interesting article that actually argues why the EFF is not able to deliver radical change in South Africa.
Earlier, I mean, we've also been seeing a lot of volatility when it comes to bonds, obviously the Rand and the benchmark stock index here. Does that volatility continue, or do you think that it might subside as we get closer and closer to that 2-week deadline?
Yeah, well, as you know, our currency is very volatile,
Yeah.
and I expect this will continue until there is final agreement.
What do you think it will get to then?
The rand sometimes goes down as far down as 19 and below to the US dollar. So I can expect any of those scenarios.
So then what changes that trajectory then? I mean, what gets the Rand strengthening again?
I think what will get the rand to stabilize is the agreement, especially between, that includes the ANC and its two breakaway parties, which is the Economic Freedom Fighters and the Umkhonto weSizwe MK party. Those are the two critical players to agree to be part of the, instead of staying in the opposition.
But that's what investors were concerned about, especially when we think about some of the policies of the EFF and the MK, like nationalizing the Reserve Bank and mines. It sounds like you're saying them being a part of the government of national unity will end up stabilizing the economy?
Oh, it will stabilize the economy. There's a lot of exaggerated fears in South Africa about the economic freedom fighters. They're not as radical as many people think they are. They believe, which is an old African nationalist belief, that the state must play a prominent role in the economy. But when it actually comes to practice, as I have pointed out, the state has been an obstacle. State-owned industries have been an obstacle to the performance of the South African economy. Economic freedom fighters know that as well as I do. So they understand that there has to be a private sector participation in the key logistics and power generation industries.
Yeah, interesting speech. What do you guys think? Moeletsi Mbeki is one of South Africa's top political analysts at the moment, and when he speaks, you want to listen and pick some points. So as he argues that the EFF is not as radical as it sells itself to be. And this article here by Andile Zulu, it's on the Jacobins online. It's easily readable. He's actually arguing, for the fact that the ENC, why the EFF actually is unable to deliver radical change in South Africa. So it argues that the EFF, Economic Freedom Fighters, positions itself as a radical party opposed to the ruling government. But it says that its race-centric program overlooks the main source of oppression in post-apartheid South Africa, which is capitalism. And this is a really important point because you see, a lot of people in South Africa, I think in the last video I made here, it argues that 10% of the population in South Africa control 82% of the resources of South Africa. So we see that, capitalism, as this article argues here, is actually the main the main source of oppression, as it's argued in this regime of post-apartheid South Africa. So post 1994 South Africa is actually plagued by capitalism, and Julius Malema's EFF party. Although Julius Malema argues that the EFF's fight is against white monopoly capital, this article here explains that Julius Malema is actually missing the main source of oppression, which is capitalism, and not necessarily, the apartheid oppression that seems to be continuously repeated in the post-apartheid regime. But it argues here that capitalism is the main source of oppression in South Africa. So it says that reading the Economic Freedom Fighters EFF manifesto for the last general election in 2019 and watching their online series, one sees a party that offers a Pan-African socialism. The thought of Frantz Fanon has converged with Marxist-Leninism to supposedly deliver a revolution deferred 27 years ago. But post-apartheid politicians are infamous for talking left and walking in every other direction. Has the EFF professed commitment to socialism remained steadfast? Have their radical ideals been made tangible in the actions of the party throughout its brief history? An overview of the EFF in the past and present reveals a party bloated by ideological ambiguity and contradiction. Yeah, let's break that down. So it says that the EFF lacks an ideological anchor. They often misdiagnose the source of the country's major crisis, offering antiquated solutions while also undermining their ability to achieve their stated objectives. So it argues that they can be classified as electoral populists, where populism is a style of politics and a set of strategies used to amass power. Because the party is entangled in ideological disorder, issues of race are dangerously misunderstood and exploited for electoral gains or trivial wars of identity. The project of kindling class consciousness and building working class power from the bottom up is cast aside, and once again, citizens are left yearning for radical change through a political party that cannot deliver it. So it says that in South Africa, we are still to deal with class divisions. At the core of our divisions is racism, says Malema. Populists on both right and left often portray the struggle for political power as one erupting between corrupt elite and oppressed masses. So that's populism. Traditional populism actually has us versus them perspective, to the organization of the masses in any society. That us now represents the lower class, while the them is usually an elite, a form of elite. But there's usually this us them dichotomy that actually characterizes what populism represents. So it speaks about how for the EFF, the great divide is between a wealthy white minority and the destitute black masses, whose oppression and exploitation both produces and sustains white economic domination. Racial inequality is the central factor which fuels the EFF's program. This presents a problem not only for the EFF, but for anyone seeking to diagnose the source of the country's major ills. No one awake in South Africa's reality can reasonably deny the disastrous impact of the systemic racism. But as an explanation for all social and economic issues, racism only takes us so far when trying to understand the nature of oppression. It says that racism is a fluent and visceral expression of class domination under capitalism. The mass poverty, unemployment, and exploitation long endured by black South Africans is a result of capitalism's imperatives. These imperatives exclude most people from assessing the means of producing wealth by exalting the use of private property for making and hoarding profit. And so this is why the EFF usually argues that its fight is against white monopoly capital, so arguing that that capital has been monopolized by whites, you see, and that it wants to redistribute, especially land. We know that land is a core capital, factor of production, and so the EFF is actually out for that. It speaks that those locked out of such access, especially those locked out of access of this monopoly, this capital that is being monopolized by a few, private property. It says those that are locked out of the access to that become an underclass which must work in life-draining servitude for pitiful wages. Now, it argues that race, as we understand it today, is a myth. refined over centuries to justify capitalism's class divisions. Those branded as inferior or barely human can be treated as expendable tools to amass wealth for the comfort and domination of a superior minority. Colonial conquerors and the apartheid regime used the myth of racial identities to legitimize their conquest and accumulation. Because revolution was deferred in 1994, primarily due to interests of global and local capital, the exploitative structure of apartheid's economy largely persists in our present. Now, it argues that the EFF's obsession with racial divisions is misleading. The reclaiming of white wealth will not lead to black liberation. Moreover, the rhetoric of anti racism can be co opted by black people hoping to change the racial composition of inequality, but not inequality itself. And such ambitions are often expressed as a desire to rid our economy of white supremacy. But if relations of class domination and exploitation persist, so will destitution for most black people. Remember that a small black elite has found success in the post apartheid era. But those black faces in high places have no interest in advancing liberation. Their class positions as corporate managers, career politicians, and successful tenderpreneurs compel them to pursue self enrichment. And importantly, to keep intact an economic order which keeps the working class exactly where they are. Now, it argues that the EFF has offered stirring critiques of capitalism, but the future they offer is not socialist. It is not of an economy democratically run by workers or a society held together by communal ownership and collective decision making, where all contribute and benefit in accordance with their needs and abilities. So that's what socialism represents. So it argues that the future that the EFF promises is not socialism in itself, although it critiques capitalism and the amassment of capital by a superior minority. The future the EFF prefers is not socialism, but it's something else. So it argues that that something else is that a proposal of an economy partly managed by the state on behalf of citizens, with some sectors still under the reins of private interests. So you see, the future that the EFF promises is not socialism as it were, but it's a kind of like an economic arrangement where the state manages the resources of the people on behalf of the citizens. Anyway, it goes on to argue that, saying that, can this top-down state-led approach to transforming the economy be trusted? In other words, is the party of Julius Malema truly fighting for the working class? A concerning and constant criticism of the EFF is the absence of a democratic culture within the party. Old and current members have revealed how the organization shuts down criticism or constructive dissent, preferring loyalty to the thinking of the executive leadership. One also can't overlook the intense adoration for Commander-in-Chief Julius Malema within the party. This adoration can be fierce, to the point that members defend some of Malema's disturbing remarks or harass those, particularly journalists, who criticize their leader. Now, it goes on to say that this lack of a democratic culture is another reason for the EFF's ideological confusion. Stifling criticism and centering a party around its top brass of leadership limits the capacity for new ideas or new strategies for advancing its objectives. This erases the possibility of moving beyond its contradictions. It also produces a leadership that evades accountability while treating its members as instruments for political ambitions. So it argues that it's hard to imagine that a party so presently hostile to a democratic culture could suddenly embrace democracy once it's in executive power, or that it could be democratic in its management of the state and national resources. So it argues that it is the working class which actually produces society's wealth. And if it becomes aware it argues that if the working class becomes aware of its status and it's mobilized, it can threaten the power of capital using immense leverage. Historically, this has made it a pivotal force for radical change. Although the EFF is not totally distanced from the working class, many of its members are poor and working class, its relationship is not one of steadfast solidarity. So this is a critique of the EFF. It argues that the EFF's engagement with with this grouping, is largely opportunistic. That the EFF's identification with the poor in South Africa is opportunistic, it's sporadic, and guided by authoritarian impulses. Therefore, the party is unlikely to pose a significant threat to capital's political power or economic might. So he argues that grassroots movements across the country, across South Africa, such as Amadiba Crisis Committee and Abalili based Mjondolo, have courageously fought and won valuable victories over mass evictions, labor disputes, municipal corruption, xenophobia, and food security. But the EFF's interaction with these progressive agents have been lackluster at best. It has often been absent in the struggles of rural women against mining industries or in the fight of the poor against violent evictions. Some grassroots movements have even condemned the EFF as opportunists, rejecting the party with fierce contempt. So it continues on to say that um, if the EFF were seriously pursuing socialism, they would understand that it cannot be won through the ballot box alone. Outside government, there exist zones of power within the media, the state, the educational system, and of course the private sector. That function all these function to maintain the supremacy of capital along the political order which sustains it. And to combat these concentrations of power, a working class movement is needed to consistently exert pressure for radical change, challenge dominant ideologies, and combat the inevitable state violence that will result from such mass mobilization. Without such a sustained movement, says this article, any radical party will not be able to defend itself against an onslaught of opposition from those eager to preserve the status quo. Almost a decade since its creation, the EFF is not firmly rooted in the working class, therefore undermining its own proclaimed goals. The EFF argues this article that the EFF is neither fascist nor legitimately leftist. Devoid of ideological clarity, mostly disengaged from the working class, and reluctant to embrace democracy within the party, they are bound to a populism that can invite great attention and perhaps gain them some electoral advances, but ultimately they will not be an avenue for radical change. So this article is actually a critique of the of the EFF's modus operandi, how the EFF approaches. It argues that the EFF, brands itself as a leftist, socialist, Fanonian, Marxist-Leninist organization that actually wants to expropriate land and seek radical change in South Africa. But this article is actually arguing that the EFF, is not really grounded, especially in its policies, in socialism. But although that it critiques capitalism and capital use of capital, it actually professes a future that is not socialism, but it's a future that wants to give more power to the state to manage resources, national resources on behalf of the citizens, and argues that that's not socialism, but it's a different kind of future. But anyway, I don't know. The EFF has amassed a great following across the world. In Africa, it's really being supported largely by a majority of black people who feel offended and disrespected by their leaderships in their countries, and they really want a radical change. And we know that radical change is usually professed by the EFS as coming from a socialist direction, in the likes of the kinds of scientific socialism that was led by Kwame Nkrumah in the 1950s and 60s before he was out kicked out by the military coup of February 24th, 1966. And so knowing fully well about that, the EFF still pushes for a socialist drive to push one Africa, one military, one market, one police force, one army, for Africa. But anyway, this article actually criticizes the EFF that its future is not a socialist future, but it's something else. We really do not know how to access that. We really do not know if probably the EFF has a different game plan to unveil its socialism when it gets into power. But for now, it argues, for an exoneration of state power and nationalization of mines and banks and a control of the state on behalf of the citizens. But anyway, I don't know. It's been a lot of information anyway, ideological information. We know that on this channel, we want this channel to be purely academic, where we think, for Africa, we think Africa and, make logical back and forth arguments to test the validity of arguments that are being thrown out there for Africa's liberation. But anyway, what do you guys think about this video and this analysis here? Share your thoughts in the comments.